Hi, and welcome to our Friends Heritage Project, Chapter 2. We entitled this Quaker Aristocrats, and in this particular chapter, we're going to talk about some Quakers that many people will have heard of. We'll also introduce a concept of what's called the priesthood of the believers, and hopefully, if you're the leader, you've read ahead and you've gone out and bought some Cadbury chocolate as our handout today. So,
I'm Philip Cox. Some of the famous Quakers we're going to be talking about are George Fox, William Penn, Herbert Hoover. And in each case, we're going to focus on one specific thing that really made them excel. We've got a lot of information on all of these people, but we're really focusing on one element of their lives, one impact that they had. George Fox, for example, was known for his prayer, a powerful prayer warrior.
Robert Barclay was actually a writer, scholar, first-rate scholar who traveled with George Fox. And many of the early writings of Quakers will be attributed to him. Of course, the name Barclays was his family, and they later on founded a very large bank that many people will be familiar with.
William Penn was a great statesman and theological writer. In this particular case, we're going to focus on his founding of the Pennsylvania colony that instituted freedom of religion. It was the first large-scale government to ever institute freedom of religion for all of its citizens.
John Archdale, a little bit lesser figure, but in South Carolina, also did some unique things. He was a Quaker and came over to the New World at that time and said you have to treat Indians equal. Set up court system that treated Indians and slaves equally. That was never, not heard of in those particular times. Another person we'll talk about is Herbert Hoover, Quaker and of course President of the United States, but had a tremendous ministry pre and post presidency also.
Jane Addams is often considered to be the founder of the social worker movement. She was the first person to establish a settlement house in the city of Chicago to help immigrants as they moved to the New World. Taman Maeda, a famous Japanese educator, was the Minister of Education after World War II. Also, he's well known for being one of the three founders of the Sony Corporation.
Now, we're assembling a kit for the leader, and this particular video is part of that kit that you can watch and get a close working knowledge of what's going on in this chapter. Every chapter has a handout, and every chapter has an experience. This week's handout is chocolate. Now, this should excite the class a little bit. Cadbury is a Quaker family that makes, of course, high-quality chocolate. And I would recommend that you buy that ahead of time, and at this particular point in the class, you hand that out and read the story of the Cadbury family. Very dynamic story, some great people who really did some neat things. Then we also want to talk about maybe leaders in the Quaker movement who people may be a little bit more familiar with or a little bit more contemporary. So for instance, John Greenleaf Whittier was a leading light against slavery in academic and legislative circles. And so we've done a nice write-up on him. And for the experience for this particular week, what I would recommend is that you recruit ahead of time a woman to read one of John Greenleaf's poems that talks about a heartbroken mother whose daughters are sold into slavery away from her and they have to leave her. I recommend that you arrange the class in the setting of a Quaker meeting like always, but and that's in the write-up also. But then have the class be very quiet and have a woman read this particular poem. It's very powerful, has some fantastic imagery in it, and that's the experience for this particular week. Now, in addition to that, your church, and in my case, my church, has some connections with some Quakers, the Marshburn family, for instance, who were very instrumental at the start of our church. There are also going to be Quakers in your church's, shall we say, circle of influence. And I would recommend that you bring them into this particular presentation. If you have a famous Quaker or a relative that was a famous Quaker, go ahead and pull slides out and interject yours so that it has more of a personal feel to it.
Lastly, one of the main themes that we want to really bring out in this chapter is how Friends have been famous for their impact, the impact that they leave on changed lives. we're going to draw a parallel here between William Penn and his father, Sir Admiral William Penn. This slide shows the chapel in which Sir Admiral William Penn is buried. Famous, wealthy, influential person. His son was even more known throughout the entire European continent for this holy experiment that he was trying in the Pennsylvania colony. And yet, the chapel that he worshipped in, the chapel that he's buried in, is so much more humble. Here's a picture of Tim outside kneeling at his gravestone. There's nothing really special about it. It shows his name, his wife's name, and the year they died, and that's pretty much it.
And the significance of that is that Quakers believe in this concept of the priesthood of believers. And we wrote that up, and you'll do a little bit more research as you read. We really want to emphasize to the class that it's that inward change that's so significant. And we also want you to have the liberty to modify this presentation to bring in Quakers that they'll know that are making a significant difference. For example, in our church, we have a Quaker, his name is Dan Eitzen. He's ministered to Muslims for many, many decades, and I put a picture of him in this presentation to call attention to the fact that Quakers are still having an impact today.
Yeah. Scott and Andrea Swart over in Cambodia, again, people having a huge influence on people's lives. Or Bob and Debbie Adhikari in Nepal. Quakers who are making a huge impact, not building monuments, but changing people's lives.
At our church, we had an older lady who had a great impact on many, many lives. Her name was Vita Lindsay. I put a picture of her in. We dedicated a playground to her. She ran small schools for a long time. And I really would encourage you to personalize this particular presentation with pictures that people will recognize and stories of people who have had an inward change that resulted in outward impact. At the end of every class, we shake hands to adjourn the class. It's important that we call attention to this, that when two Quakers at the end of a meeting go and shake hands, that means the meeting's adjourned. Usually you adjourn the meeting by closing in prayer, but most Quaker meetings had so much prayer in it that they adjourned by shaking hands. So I would recommend at the end of these classes that you turn to somebody, shake hands, and that signifies the end of the class. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in Chapter 3.